So now joining me on the video link is a gentleman who's had a very long and established career in the ambulance service, and well before the HSE and the National Ambulance was set up, bringing me back to the early days of the National Ambulance Service. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Lawrence Kenna, retired Training and Education Officer with the National Ambulance Service. Lawrence, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thanks very much, Declan. Thank you.
You've had a very, very well 40-year career in the ambulance service in before the HSE and the NAS. Where was your first station, and where did it all begin, I suppose, for yourself in the ambulance service?
Well, I suppose it started before the ambulance service, to be honest with you. I've been working for nearly 50 years. I had trained as a sheet metal worker in Guinness's in the 70s. And while I was in there, I joined the Order of Malta. But I had started off there with the order in about 72, I think. And once I started in that, to be honest with you, there was only one thing I ever wanted to do, and that was work on the ambulance. And I waited for the jobs. I finished my trade, waited for the jobs to come up, and eventually applied to the Eastern Health Board, as it was, in 1980. So I went into Naas Ambulance Station. And at the time, the service was more or less transitioning from driver, ambulance nurse to ambulance driver, ambulance attendant. So the attendants were more or less, most of them had moved out of the hospital from porters onto the ambulance. And then some came in from the voluntaries, and I came in from the voluntaries. And I spent 2 years in Naas. On the Naas ambulance, and then moved over to Maynooth, and Maynooth was probably probably was the first ambulance in the country that had dual purpose, so both drove and both attended, and I spent about 8 years there. Yeah, so that was probably the start of it, really.
And I suppose during your career in the ambulance service, in the early days, vehicles and equipment and safety procedures and so on, very few and far between. How did you and your colleagues, I suppose, cope with all of that years ago when we don't have what's here now?
Yeah, I think it was a different service that you went into. Like the calls are the same, to be honest with you. Like the calls are still the RTCs, the maternities. Like when I started in Naas, we would have done a lot of transfers in and out of Naas to Dr. Stevens's, which was open at the time, which is a major hospital. So the patient doesn't change. The patient is the same. The calls are generally the same. When we would have started, we would have had 2 stretcher ambulances. And so, and the stretchers were seats as well. So you could have anything up to eight sitting patients in the ambulance or 2 stretcher cases, you know. So you're starting off like that. It was basic life support.
Was it easier to deal with patients those days, or I suppose now where there's a huge amount of safety precautions and restrictions you mentioned about, and I do remember the ambulance with the 2 stretchers and so on. Now it's only 1, but would it have been easier at that time than it is now?
Yeah, well, it's different. We didn't take the job any less serious. Like, as you probably see from one of the photos, me standing in front of the ambulance, having like the ambulances were spotless, absolutely spotless. We had a lot of pride in the uniform and how we portrayed the service. So the job was as serious. The staff in the job took the job as serious as they do today, you know, and we cared for our patients as well. Like there's like from a BLS point of view, that's what we did. But when I started, we had no medications, we had no defibrillators. In fact, I was a year in the job before I did any training. You know, I would have had my training in the Order of Malta. But,
so you were finding your feet, as it were.
Yeah, that's the job you went into. Very little documentation in the early 80s.
And you mentioned the Order of Malta, and it's always very good to involve the voluntary services, because I think it's a great stepping stone for any member of the voluntary services to step into either medical, Garda, fire, or whatever. How long were you in the Order of Malta, and I suppose that gave you the interest and the training, Lawrence?
Yeah, well, I was in the order for I suppose I was in it for about 10 years. You could say full time, because when you do volunteerism, it's full time. You can be doing it 5 nights a week or 7 nights a week. That's the type it is. But I did it up to about 82, and then I would have helped them for a couple of years after that, and then I would have moved out of it more or less. But whether it be Alder Malta or St. John or Red Cross, any of those volunteer organisations that are related to the EMS part of society, and because there's volunteers everywhere within all aspects of society, and the state can't do without volunteerism. You know, it cannot do it. Like we saw that last year when we had the snow and we had the likes of Civil Defence and Red Cross out with their 4x4s assisting the statutory services. You know, they can't do without volunteerism. And then we have the likes of the CFR, which the community first responders volunteering in their own area. And the likes of that has been colossal in terms of resuscitation and the pre-hospital CPR and that type of effort, you know. So yeah, volunteerism is really, really important.
And I suppose, I know you've started in 1980. You were 2 years doing the Order Malta when you started in the Eastern Health Board as well. I suppose in recent years, how did you transition then from the paramedic side of it to the training officer side?
Well, I had moved to Loughlinstown in '89, and at the time, Dublin was the only area that had defibrillators. They didn't have defibs outside of Dublin, all right? And so I had been doing a course, a UK course, that was all about anatomy and physiology, and it was all about the advanced EMT at the time in the UK. It was with a group called the Ambulance Service Institute. And myself, I had followed Brian Power in doing that course. Brian had done the course. I think it was the first one in Ireland to do it. And I had done it. And I started looking 5 years on at advanced level while I was doing this course. So I wanted to do the paramedic. We hadn't even got, or I wanted to do the defibrillation. So I went over to Loughlinstown. And at the time you had the city and the country. It was completely separate. Even though it might have been the one service, it was completely separate. Even in terms of pay, it was separate. So I went over there. I did my defibrillator training course, which I was delighted with. And then eventually, I had an interest in the training part of it. I remember a colleague of mine who was in training, Declan Keogh, he said to me, something I'll never forget. He said that while you're on the ambulance, you can influence your colleague or those around you. But when you're in training, you can influence a whole class. You know, so you have a whole class there, 32 or whatever. You can influence that group and the next group and the next group. So I think training officers can have a really, really positive influence on the service, on the staff, on the personnel, and therefore on the station. You know,
absolutely.
And that sort of got me into it. Now it got me away from shift work, which I loved. The face-to-face contact with patients, which I loved. You know, like that's the best part of the job, to be quite honest with you. But it did get me into training, and I still held on to a lot of the face-to-face contact I had with patients in the role that I was in. You know, so I enjoyed that part of it.
And I suppose as training and education officer, Lawrence, you've taught many people throughout the National Ambulance Service, and of course that evolved then for other organisations. I remember at 2 Respond CFR conferences in Mullingar, I was recording down there, and I think both yourself and Mark Callanan were instructing a workshop, and just to sit back and look at the work and the training that you provide is excellent. There's great value in the volunteers such as that. I suppose you mentioned about a highlight. You've seen many changes over the years, Lawrence, indeed in the health service and the ambulance service. as your career in the ambulance service, what's been your highlight?
Well, there are so many highlights, not personal highlights, to be quite honest with you, but there are so many highlights in 40 years, and probably ones that you wouldn't be familiar with, but you might look up now. The 1993 Ambulance Review. If you haven't looked at that, have a look at that, because it's from that review came the EMT courses, conversion training for the staff that we had on the road. It was probably the first foot into the academic arena with UCD, because they offered a diploma with the conversion program for the staff that were there. That talked about single controls. Like at the time, when I came into the job, every hospital controlled its own ambulances. So you might have had 30 or 40 ambulance controls. So that talked about amalgamating all the controls. And at the time, I think in the 90s, then you would have had the NAC, the National Ambulance Advisory Council, which was more or less an advisory body. Again, and they were an advisory body in relation to standards and training. Like, again, in the 80s, the standard was the school. The school was the standard, and now the college, as it is now, is part of the standard. There are so many other training institutions that are out there, and then all overseen by the FEC. So it's, again, the 1993 review, the FEC, the commencement of the FEC, that's huge. That's probably one of the biggest game changers with clinical practice guidelines, the register, the advanced paramedic, all of that the FEC brought along, and that would have been instigated by the team in NACE, obviously,
And I suppose they're the highlights, and they would have been huge assets to the ambulance service and indeed the health service as well.
Yeah.
Is there any particular incident over your career that sticks out, I suppose, good, bad, or indifferent, Lawrence?
Calls wise?
Yeah, I suppose going back to your first station in NACE or your second in Maynooth, is there any call that sticks in your mind of, God, that was a bad one or a good one, or what jumps out?
Well, there's lots of them, to be honest with you. It's probably the thing about practitioners, pre-hospital practitioners, that they don't tend to, they might have a conversation about calls among their colleagues, but they don't tend to talk about particular calls with anybody outside of the road. They would have called. Everybody has calls that they think about, and particularly calls relating to pediatrics and trauma and that type of thing. But what you tend to do is you tend to compartmentalize it. That's what I do. I don't. It was never something that I ever. Once you did the call, and that's it. And you might think about it every now and again, or the individuals that you would have managed or cared for. But after that, you don't dwell on it.
And it's something that's progressed, I suppose, over the years in all the services with the CSM, the Critical Incident Stress Management.
Absolutely.
You've sent me in some lovely photographs, Lawrence, and I'd say some of them are probably, looking over them, they're emotional, I'd imagine.
Yeah, there's one there, there's a black and white one there that was probably, I'm on the, if you don't recognize me, I think I'm on the left-hand side there. And I didn't have a uniform at that stage. So that must be in the first 2 or 3 months that I joined. And the person in the middle, sitting in the middle, he's retiring. So I suppose I would say about at least 3 or 4 of the people on the top row are probably deceased now. So it's probably a reminder that we're really what we were doing is building the job. We're all foundations for the job. That's all we are. We're minding it for the next generation. So that's and so when I came in, I was minding it for the group that had built it up to what it was, and that's really what we're doing. We're trying to make it better for the next group of people that are coming along. And certainly in terms of training, within the services, and the operational training officer. Really, that's what you're doing. You're like, I would have built a team in the East. You have Shane Mooney there now, who's taken hold there, and he's building his team. And they're doing fantastic work in terms of the training that's going on in the east of the country, and that's replicated throughout the National Ambulance Service.
Well, you've minded the ambulance service very well, as you say. You have minded it, and you've brought it in training wise. I suppose you've done a huge amount of work in that. Leaving the ambulance service a couple of weeks ago, a lovely presentation, and I saw it on Twitter and so on. So what's in store for you now, Lawrence? What's any plans, or where do you go from here?
Well, you always have a plan, but unfortunately, COVID has sort of knocked out the plan. The plan was to go to Spain for a month and try and forget about the job, because it's a bit of a wrench, obviously. My other half, Carl, had planned to get 2 season tickets for Villa Park. I'm a staunch Aston Villa supporter, have been since I was about 8 or 9. And it says a bit about loyalty, because it can be hard to be loyal to a team like Aston Villa, to be honest with you, because they're taking us down to Division 3 and back up again. But loyalty is really important. I'm a gym person. Normally, I'm a spin person. I'm normally a 6 o'clock in the morning person in the gym. But again, that's been knocked on the head. So it's out for a 10K walk every morning. I've been learning piano for about 10 years. I'm no better than I was 10 years ago because I don't practice. So it gives me a little bit more time to practice, a bit more time at home. I have 4 grandchildren, so a little bit more time with them, and more time with, obviously, my wife, who doesn't have to put the dinner back in the oven. She's had it for the last 20 odd or 30 years. Every time she got a call to say I was going to be late, and any of the managers that have response cards, they know that once they're on the road, they're liable to get a call, and you're only home when you're home. So that's so a bit more time at home. But I was just going to say, my dad lived till he was 94, and he didn't retire till he was 85. So I have no intentions of stopping work. I'm open to offers, so I won't be sitting around, to be honest with you.
Well, that's a good thing, because being fit and active after retirement, just because people are retired, they don't stop, and they shouldn't stop. You mentioned about your spin classes. Only last week I was talking to Mayo County Council's acting Chief Fire Officer, Tony Shevlin, and he was telling me he's doing Pilates as well, all because of COVID and all because of trying to keep fit and active. And that's a very, very good thing, and it's good for the body and mind. Lawrence, obviously you've met a lot of people across the years in various services, and I suppose you want to thank some of them as well.
Yeah, I absolutely, I do. I want to thank all my colleagues in the National Ambulance Service, the Dublin Fire Brigade, and obviously across the General HSE for all the cards, the emails, texts, hundreds of the messages that I've received in the last month, and obviously for those that some of the important aspects of the job that I haven't mentioned in this. I don't know how long we've been on for, about 20 minutes. But there's so many other things that I haven't mentioned. But as we said at the start, there's a book there somewhere.
There is a book there somewhere. Look, Lawrence Kenna, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Retired training officer of the National Service. Thanks very much indeed, Lawrence, and take care.
Thanks, Declan. Thank you.